Welcome to your next great novel. This is your host, Phil Williams. Today I'm here with my lovely co-host, Denise Williams, and we'll be discussing the nonfiction book, The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. How are you doing, Denise?
I am well, thank you.
The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin is the story of money and banking and the Federal Reserve. It explains how money is created. It details the birth of the Federal Reserve and the secrets of central banking. This book is about the biggest and most blatant scam to ever exist.
That sounds crazy, but it's true.
It is true. This is a very long book, 600 pages, so we're going to talk about some of the major points. We'll discuss the following. What is the Federal Reserve System? How money is created? The connection between fiat money and war? And who wins, who loses, and the end game.
By the way, for the listeners that don't know, fiat money is essentially money by decree or money created out of thin air.
So, what is the Federal Reserve System, Denise?
Well, according to their website, the Federal Reserve System is the central bank of the United States. It performs 5 general functions to promote the effective operation of U.S. economy and, more generally, the public interest. 1. Conducts the nation's monetary policy to promote maximum employment, stable prices, and interest rates. 2. Promotes the stability of the financial system and seeks to minimize and contain systematic risks through active monitoring and engagement in the U.S. and abroad. 3. Promotes safety and soundness of individual financial institutions. 4. Fosters payment and settlement system safety and efficiency through services to the banking industry and the U.S. government that facilitates U.S. dollars transactions and payments. And 5. Promotes consumer protection and community development.
Bear in mind, that's from the Federal Reserve's own website. So just keep that in the back of your mind as we're describing what they actually do and how they actually do it. So we get a glimpse of their propaganda.
I was trying to read them without sarcasm.
Right. So here are a few facts about the Federal Reserve. First of all, it's not federal, and there are no reserves. It's a cartel of private banks that form a quasi-governmental entity for the purpose of furthering the business interests of the private banks, not the American people. To really understand the Fed, I think we have to go back to the creation. Several times prior to 1913 and prior to 1910, bankers tried to establish a central bank in the U.S., but it was defeated. In 1910, 6 men boarded a train to Jekyll Island. These 6 men represented about a quarter of the wealth of the entire world. And according to the Creature from Jekyll Island, that's conservative. He thinks it probably was more than a quarter of the wealth of the entire world. So on this train was Nelson Aldrich, who was the Republican whip in the Senate. He was chairman of the National Monetary Commission and business associate of J.P. Morgan, and he was John D. Rockefeller's father-in-law. There was Abraham Piatt Andrew, who was the assistant secretary of the U.S. Treasury. There was Frank Vanderlip. He was president of National City Bank of New York, which at the time was the most powerful bank, and he represented William Rockefeller and the international investment banking house of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. Then there was Henry Davison, who was a senior partner of J.P. Morgan Company, and Benjamin Strong, who was head of J.P. Morgan's Bankers Trust Company. And lastly was Paul Warburg, a partner in Kuhn, Loeb and Company, and a representative of the Rothschild banking dynasty in England and France, and brother to Max Warburg, who was the head of the Warburg Banking Consortium in Germany and the Netherlands. Here's a fun fact. The character, Daddy Warbucks in Little Orphan Annie, was supposedly modeled after Paul Warburg.
Interesting.
Yeah. So in secret, these 6 bankers went to Jekyll Island in 1910 and drafted the plan for the Federal Reserve System.
Jekyll Island, by the way, is off the coast of Georgia.
Right. And what emerged from Jekyll Island was a cartel agreement with the wealthiest banks and men to do 5 things. Number one, what they wanted to do was stop the competition from newer banks, obtain a franchise to create money out of nothing for the purpose of lending. Number three, they wanted to get control of the reserves of all the banks so that the more reckless ones would not be exposed to currency drains and bank runs. Number four, they wanted to get the taxpayer to pick up the cartel's inevitable losses. And number five, to convince Congress that the purpose was to protect the public.
Well, absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Well, they definitely were able to get absolute power. You're right about that. These men knew to achieve their goals that they'd have to partner with the U.S. government, and the structure of the cartel would have to be a central bank. And 2 days before Christmas in 1913, Woodrow Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act into law. The most important thing to understand about the Federal Reserve is to understand how money is created. And to understand that, we have to first understand how banks create money. Denise, can you tell the listeners a little bit about how banks create money and how they make a profit?
Okay, let's say you move to a new town where a brand new bank has opened. You deposit $1,000 in the bank. You, as a depositor, now have a $1,000 asset, your bank account, and the bank has a $1,000 liability, your same bank account. There is a federal rule that permits the banks to lend out a percentage of their deposits to people who wish to borrow money. That amount is 90%. In reality, banks often loan closer to 100%. But in the spirit of simplicity, let's stick to the rule. Banks make a profit by charging a higher interest rate to borrowers than they pay in the interest to depositors. Right now, savings accounts yield less than 1%, while a car loan would probably be 5% or so. Depending on your credit rating, banks profit from the difference or the spread, so banks must lend in order to profit. Our fictional bank is quick to lend 90% of your $1,000 to your new neighbor. Your neighbor borrows $900 and buys a butchered hog from a farmer. The farmer then deposits the $900 into the bank. Another neighbor borrows 90% of $900, which is $810. The neighbor buys groceries, and the grocer deposits the money in the bank. And like magic, another 90% of the $810 is available for loan. The next neighbor can borrow $729, and on it goes. This is fractional reserve banking, and this is how the banks can turn $1,000 into $10,000. You might be wondering what would happen if all the depositors came into the bank and withdrew their deposits. There is only $1,000 on reserve, so most of the depositors would not receive their money. This is called a bank run, and it happened many times throughout history.
That's true. There are still two problems with your explanation, though. If everyone repays their loans all at once, all the money in the system is extinguished. But what about the interest on the loans? And where the heck did the original $1,000 come from?
Well, that's where the Federal Reserve comes into the story. Let's say the U.S. government wants to spend more money than it has.
Well, that happens all the time.
Absolutely. The U.S. government has over $1 trillion yearly budget deficit right now. In order to raise the needed cash above and beyond taxes, the U.S. Treasury Department will print Treasury bills, bonds, and notes, which are the same thing with different maturities and interest rates. These bonds, bills, and notes are sold in scheduled auctions. They are mostly purchased by banks, other financial institutions, and central banks of other countries. New money is created when the Federal Reserve buys a Treasury bond, bill, or note from a bank. When the Federal Reserve makes a purchase, it pays for the bond with money that was created out of thin air.
That's really important. So I'll repeat that for the listeners. When the Federal Reserve makes this purchase, it pays for the bond with money that was created out of thin air. I know that sounds crazy, but I pulled a quote from an article published by the Federal Reserve. It says, "When you or I write a check, there must be sufficient funds in our account to cover the check. But when the Federal Reserve writes a check, there is no bank deposit on which the check is drawn. When the Federal Reserve writes a check, it is creating money." So there it is.
G. Edward Griffin has a really good quote that sums it up perfectly. He said, The bottom line is that Congress and the banking cartel, the Federal Reserve, have entered into a partnership in which the cartel has the privilege of collecting interest on money which it creates out of nothing, a perpetual override on every American dollar that exists in the world. Congress, on the other hand, has access to unlimited funding without having to tell voters their taxes are being raised through the process of inflation. So this means that we pay the government not just with taxes, but also with inflation or devaluing our money.
Now that we have some idea how our monetary and banking system works, let's talk a little about how this system makes it possible and, dare I say, encourages war. Every modern war is funded with thin air money and debt, or inflation and debt, because thin air money creates inflation, which is a fancy word for saying that the Fed is making every dollar in existence worth less by creating more of them. If people actually had their taxes raised to pay for wars, people would be very opposed to wars. Instead, they create money out of thin air, and people don't notice how prices go up. There are many examples, but World War I and the Lusitania incident is a very good example of this phenomena. In fact, learning about the Lusitania was the catalyst for me no longer trusting anything that any government says or does. The banks like war because it brings profit to the banks in the form of debt. It is not exactly war that bankers love, but the debt brought about by war. The only rain on this debt parade comes in the form of a default, and a default was what the European and American bankers were facing in World War I. During World War I, England and France went heavily into debt, so heavy, in fact, that the European banks could not meet their needs. The Allies turned to America and the House of Morgan, which basically is the J.P. Morgan, in partnership with the Rothschild European banking dynasty to act as sales agents for their bonds. The majority of the bond money raised for the Allies was quickly returned to purchase war materials, brokered by the House of Morgan. The House of Morgan made money coming and going, a commission when a bond was sold and another commission when the money was used to purchase war materials. Many of the companies producing the war materials were either owned outright by Morgan holding companies or within their banking sphere of control. For the House of Morgan and the European bankers, there was one big problem. The Germans were actually winning the war, and the specter of default loomed large. British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour wrote, "At that time, it certainly looked as though we were going to lose the war. With the Allies losing, the House of Morgan couldn't find new buyers for their war bonds. Without buyers for new funding or buyers for the old bonds coming due, they were facing a serious default. For the bankers, this was disastrous. If bond sales stopped, the gravy train of bonds and war material commissions would also stop. Furthermore, if the old bonds went into default, the investors would lose a tremendous amount of money. Something had to be done. That something was an American entry into World War I. Through a secret agreement brokered by Woodrow Wilson, advisor and puppeteer Colonel Edward Mandell House, the United States committed to enter into the war. House had close ties to J.P. Morgan and the European banking families. He was the inside man pulling the strings of the U.S. government in favor of the central bankers. The secret agreement wasn't enough to propel the staunchly neutral United States into the war. Edward Mandell House, the Wilson administration, and the bankers needed public support. They began to beat the war drum in the Morgan-controlled press. They spewed war propaganda on a daily basis. They denounced Germany as the enemy of Western civilization. They appealed to the patriotic duty of all Americans to defend world democracy. Despite the propaganda, it wasn't enough. Polls at the time showed very little support to enter the war. They needed something extreme, something that would change public opinion. The Lusitania was a British passenger ship that steamed between New York and Liverpool. She was the property of the Cunard Company, the only major competitor of the Morgan shipping cartel. The Lusitania was built as a luxury liner, but her specifications were drawn up by the British Admiralty, so she could be converted into a warship. The shape of her hull, the horsepower of her engines, the ammunition storage areas, among other features, were paid for by the British government. Even in peacetime, her crew included naval officers and seamen. On March 8, 1915, after several close calls with German submarines, the captain of the Lusitania turned in his resignation. He was willing to face the U-boats, he said, but he was no longer willing to carry the responsibility of mixing passengers with munitions or contraband. England needed the Americans to win the war. Winston Churchill, who was the First Lord of the Admiralty at the time, had a ruthless strategy for enticing the Americans. Cruiser rules dictated that both England and Germany would allow the crews of merchant ships to depart on lifeboats before sinking them. In October 1914, Churchill ordered British merchant ships to no longer surrender to Germany. They were to engage if they had weapons and try to ram the U-boats. In response to this policy, the U-boats stayed submerged and sunk British merchant ships without warning. Thousands of seamen lost their lives because of Churchill's cunning calculation, of which he said, "The first British countermove made on my responsibility was to deter the Germans from surface attack. The submerged U-boat had to rely increasingly on underwater attack and thus ran the greater risk of mistaking neutral for British ships and of drowning neutral crews and thus embroiling Germany with other great powers." So basically, Winston Churchill was a mass murderer. This guy wanted the Germans to sink civilian ships in order to get other countries into the war to help England out. And
that's a really unpopular opinion because so many people think Winston Churchill, think of him as this wonderful and good leader.
Yeah, absolutely. That's 100% true. That he's a revered figure for his duty in World War II. The Lusitania was in fact carrying war materials. There were 600 tons of gun cotton, 6 million rounds of ammunition, 1,248 cases of shrapnel shells, plus an unknown quantity of munitions that filled the lower decks. These weapons were all brokered through the House of Morgan. Unfortunately for the civilians who booked a ticket on the Lusitania, they were unaware that their cruise liner was carrying war materials. The German embassy, on the other hand, they were well aware of the munitions loaded on the Lusitania. They filed a formal complaint with the U.S. government, stating that the munitions were a violation of international neutrality treaties. The Wilson administration denied any knowledge of the munitions.
The Germans actually tried to warn the American public.
That's right.
They purchased week-long ads in 50 newspapers the week before the Lusitania was set to sail. The U.S. State Department intervened, ensuring the ads would never run. One ad did slip through the propaganda model and was printed in the Des Moines Register. The ad was placed in the travel section next to an advertisement and departure schedule for the Lusitania. The ad said, "Notice, travelers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies. That the zone of war includes the waters adjacent to the British Isles, that in accordance with the formal notice given by the Imperial German government, vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or any of her allies are liable to destruction in those waters, and that travelers sailing in the war zone on ships of Great Britain or her allies do so at their own risk. Imperial German Embassy, Washington, D.C., April 22nd, 1915.
Right. So that actual ad is in The Creature from Jekyll Island. He's got a picture of the ad. And the Lusitania left New York a few days after that ad went out. That ad went out on April 22nd, 1915. And the Lusitania left New York on May 1st, 1915, with orders to meet a British destroyer called the Juno off the coast of Ireland for protection as the cruise liner entered U-boat infested waters. So it needed to go in there with some protection. So when the Lusitania arrived at the meeting point, the Juno wasn't there. The captain of the Lusitania thought that they had missed each other in the fog. The truth was that the Juno had been called from the area, and the captain of the Lusitania was not informed. To add insult to injury, the Lusitania was ordered to cut back on coal usage, not because of a shortage, but to save money. The Lusitania slowly steamed into U-boat patrolled waters without an escort. One of the officers present in the high command map room on that fateful day was Commander Joseph Kenworthy, who previously had been called upon by Churchill to submit a paper on what would be the political results of an ocean liner being sunk with American passengers aboard. He left the room in disgust at the cynicism of his superiors. In 1927, in his book, The Freedom of the Seas, he wrote without further comment, "The Lusitania was sent at considerably reduced speed into an area where a U-boat was known to be waiting and her escorts withdrawn." The German
It's crazy.
Yeah, it is. The German submarine U-20 fired a single torpedo into the Lusitania that struck her starboard side. The U-20 readied a second torpedo, but there was a secondary and much larger explosion that blew the side off the cargo hold and sent the ship quickly to the bottom of the ocean. Most people think that secondary explosion was, of course, the munitions that were inside. At the time, the Lusitania was one of the largest ships ever built, and it sank in less than 18 minutes, drowning 195 Americans.
That's awful. Then they used the tragedy for their propaganda. The sinking of the Lusitania became the rallying point for the war. One ad I saw read, "Enlist," and had a woman sinking underwater holding her baby. Another showed the Lusitania sinking with people swimming for their lives.
Then 2 years later, with presidential media and now the public on board, the U.S. Congress declared war on the Axis powers, and 6 months earlier, the military had already been preparing for war, so I think they knew that they were going to be able to get this through. But it was at this time that the purse strings opened. So Congress passed the War Loan Act, which extended a $1 billion credit to the Allies. Despite the influx of cash, the British were behind on their payments to the House of Morgan. JP Morgan actually presented the bill to the U.S. government for payment. The U.S. Treasury did not have enough spendable funds available. The problem was solved with the help from Benjamin Strong of the Federal Reserve. They simply printed the money out of thin air and paid Morgan quietly in installments. The banking cartel was able, through the operation of the Federal Reserve System, to create the money to give to England and France so they, in turn, could pay back the American banks, exactly as was done in World War II and again in the big bailout of the 1980s and 90s and 2008. In 1917, the recently enacted income tax was useful for raising a sizable amount of the revenue to conduct the war, but the greatest source of the funding came, as it always does in wartime, from direct tax, not from direct taxes, but from the hidden tax called inflation. So we've already talked about this a little bit already. And this is really staggering, between 1915 and 1920, the money supply doubled from $20.6 billion to $39.8 billion. Conversely, during World War I, the purchasing power of the currency fell by almost 50%. That means Americans unknowingly paid to the government approximately 1/2 of every dollar that existed, and that was in addition to their taxes. This massive infusion of money was created by the Federal Reserve, and the banks, they collected interest on all of it.
And how do they expect the common man to ever get ahead, or to, I guess they don't.
No, they don't think that they care.
Right.
I don't think they care. I think that's a concept that people need to understand, is the government is not by the people for the people. The government is by the government for the government.
Right.
It's
Unfortunately.
It's not for us.
This book was, as I think we stated here, very eye-opening and yet depressing. It makes you think that everything's rigged. The bankers, in concert with the government, have no empathy or humanity, if you ask me.
I don't think the people that created this system, or the people currently employed or benefiting from this system, think of themselves as villains.
Of course not. Do they ever?
No, of course they don't. They believe that without their system, the economy would fall apart. They think they're doing needed, very important work. If we did away with the Fed tomorrow, the economy would initially crash, but I think we'd still be a lot better off in the long run.
It would be rough at first, but so do I. It's just like when you have a surgery to help you get better. At first, the healing process is sore and long, but then you're much better after.
Right. A few years ago, I purchased a used car. I don't know if you remember this, but I wanted to pay cash.
I do.
And when I went to the bank and asked to withdraw $3,000, the teller's eyes, it went wide, and she said that she had to go talk to her manager. I remember I did get my money that day, but they did not even have enough hundreds to give me all hundreds. I had to take a few $100s in 20s. And they asked me to let them, the next time I was going to make a large cash withdrawal, they asked me to let them know a few days ahead of time so that they could have it available. And this was a national bank.
It's totally ridiculous. I don't think people realize that when you deposit money in the bank, you're actually loaning your money to the bank to use.
Exactly. So the banking system is very, very suspect. It's not so you loan them your money and then they go and do all sorts of crazy, risky investments with your money. And then they give you not even 0.25% of interest back for your risk. So that's something to think about, is why would you want to support this system? Like Denise and I have very, very little money in the bank at all.
Right.
So it's just not something that we want to support. Who do you think wins and who do you think loses in our current debt-based monetary system?
The member banks of the Federal Reserve System in Wall Street, along with the government, are the big winners. The banks and the Fed create money out of thin air, but we have to do real work in the economy to pay them back with interest, of course. Then the government can expand its power as much as it wants because they can fund anything through inflation.
I agree.
What do you think is the end game?
The end game is the member banks own all the wealth and we're debt slaves. If you look at the numbers, most people are already debt slaves. It used to be that people had parties when they paid off their mortgages. Did your parents have a party?
Yeah, I think they did. Yeah, they had a patio party.
It was like they used to call mortgage parties, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my parents made it into a patio party. They told me about it. I was really little, but...
Yeah, so people used to have parties when they paid off their mortgages, and now people have interest-only mortgages, so they're not even paying principal. They finance cars and college and credit cards and even furniture. Our system not only encourages debt, it is an absolute necessity of the system. It's an exponential system. If there's not more debt in aggregate every year than the year before, the whole thing falls apart. And one thing I think people need to understand is, let's say every single person in the United States got together and we all got together and said, hey, we're going to pool all our money and pay off all this debt right now. If we did that, there would be no money left in the system, but we would all still owe interest to the banks. So we would all be broke, but yet we would still owe money to the banks. And that's the thing about this system. They own us.
It's really crazy and disheartening to think about.
Absolutely. So I give The Creature from Jekyll Island 5 stars. I think it's a must read for everyone, in my opinion. What about you, Denise?
Yeah, as we've stated in an earlier podcast, I am not a financial person. However, this book definitely is something that everybody should read. It kept my attention. It's a long book, but it's really important for folks to understand how the money is created. So I would give it 5 stars, definitely.
That's it for today. Thank you for listening to another episode of Your Next Great Novel. Be sure to subscribe. You can find the podcast at philwbooks.com and on iTunes, Stitcher, or TuneIn.